Okay, so here we are. This is the first keynote speaker of the Emerging Scholars Conference. Uh, we have with us Dr. Bryan Banker, and this session is going to be moderated by Eileen Pekanik. Eileen, who also happens to be an emerging scholar at IASA, is a PhD candidate in the Department of American Culture and Literature at Hacettepe University, Turkey. She received a bachelor's degree in English translation and interpretation and a master's degree in American Culture and Literature at Hacettepe University, with a thesis on the gendered design of female-coded androids in contemporary science fiction films. Her interests include audiovisual media studies, game studies, gender and queer studies, speculative fiction, and horror fiction. She is currently working on her dissertation, which examines the evolution and reclamation of queer monstrousness in horror short story anthologies, and is working as a lecturer at Bilkent University. Over to you, Eileen.
Thank you so much for introducing me. Well, welcome everyone. With two sessions past us, we are going to be listening to our first keynote today. And I will be your moderator today. I will be introducing Dr. Bryan Banker. He is an assistant professor of English language and literature at TOBB University of Economics and Technology in Ankara, Turkey. He earned his PhD in American literature from the University of Munich, Germany. Banker's areas of specialization encompass American literature and culture, post-colonial world literature, race and racialization in popular culture, philosophy, science fiction, music, and television. His publications span a wide array of themes, including race and class identity in television, racism and in the antiquities in video games, philosophy in the work of Langston Hughes and John Coltrane, and Neanderthal ontology and the dislocation of home. In 2023, Banker published in Jazz Research Journal entitled Both Directions at Once, John Coltrane, the Sonic Philosopher of Oppositions, and in 2024, Words on Fire, Langston Hughes, The Panther and the Lash, and the Emergence of the Black Hegelian Poetic in the Journal of American Studies, Turkey. Recently, he published a book chapter in Storytelling, Identity Formation and Resistance in American Indigenous Culture entitled It Knows How to Hunt, But I Know How to Survive, Identity, Resistance, and Aliens in the Film Prey from John Benjamin's. And another book chapter will be out early next year. The book will be titled The American Immigrant Narrative Revisited, and Banker's chapter is going to be The Politicians Would Like Nothing Better Than the Two of Us to Kill Each Other, Then Who Would Build Their Cities? Chinese Immigration, Irish Labor, and Racial Capitalism in the TV series Warrior. So today, Dr. Banker is going to be talking to us in a keynote entitled Engage with the Systems That Underlie the Ordinary World, Video Games, Affect, and the United States in the Global Imagination. And without further ado, I will leave the floor to Dr. Banker.
Thank you very much. I want to try, so even on Chrome, it won't move. So I'm going to lose your faces. I apologize. But can you see my screen move?
Yes.
Before I start?
Yes.
Okay. Hello, everyone, again, and thank you, Eileen, for that introduction. And of course, thanks to the organizing committee for inviting me to speak at the conference. I had a chance to go through some of the abstracts at the conference, and there are a lot of rich subjects and themes, so I'm excited to kind of join in. I participated at a similar conference earlier in the spring up at Hacettepe here in Ankara, and so it's also nice to see some friendly faces as well. And while I'm a little nervous to talk about video games, I am certain that many of you know much more about them than I. I am at least excited to present some ideas I've been thinking about, which extends much from the many conversations with my students that I have here in Ankara about video games and their gaming experiences. In talking with them, I've learned quite a lot regarding both current gaming, the level of sophistication of both gameplay, and of course, I've learned quite a bit about their high-level, thoughtful, and careful kind of thinking about video games as they play them. This is, of course, in great contrast to my own engagement in video games, and as many of my students can attest, I am not sophisticated. I basically like to go around shooting things and blowing stuff up. So I think it's fair that I at least give a shout out to my students, my beloved game nerds, for helping me think through some of the things I'll discuss today. One student in particular needs or deserves some recognition, Serdar. He helped me quite a bit in setting up this game survey, which I'll explain later. So thanks to him. Now, while I am fairly sophomoric in my gaming, I am definitely interested in both the detailed and contemplative experiences in my students' gaming, as well as all the ethical, social, and political dimensions of their gameplay. And as my students also can attest, I'm often trying to examine the way that forms impact the content of different media. And moreover, as video games demand a certain level of player agency, of interactivity, both haptic and emotional, among other facets of engagement, I often ask what then can philosophically be learned about our engagement with video games and the digital narratives produced therein. But for today, I'll leave any intelligent commentary on specific games to you guys, the experts, and instead talk more about theory, and in particular, how affect theory may potentially help us to glean some global perspective about the United States from video games. I'm going to attempt to situate my talk today with the growing research on affect theory being applied to video games, borrowing heavily from Audrey Enable's Playing with Feelings, who grounds her study on affect and casual video games, like those played on your phone, among other games. Like her work, I'll also be talking about a few of the major thinkers of affect, like Brian Masumi, Sarah Ahmed, Lauren Berlant, and Teresa Brennan, among others. I look to affect because there's a lot of video game studies that focus on meaning-centered and representational analysis, what games may say in representational registers of experience. But I'm more interested today in intensities, bodily sensations, atmospheres, and modes of attachment that shape how games are experienced. So once I give some thoughts on the uses of affect theory in the study of video games, I will turn to one primary example, which is the militaristic Call of Duty franchise, and then turn to the results of my survey, where I asked Turkish video game players on how and where they encountered the United States and what their gaming experiences have taught them about America. I'll conclude by arguing that as affect circulates among players as both attraction and critique, it intensifies a game's ideological and sensory power. I contend that as the United States emerges within and through gameplay, it does so not as some abstract geopolitical entity, but as an atmosphere, an effective and ideological environment sustained by our digital mediation. I want to start things off, though, with a step back and I guess a bit of a provocation, as it inspired my thinking about feeling. So beginning in September, the US military confirmed multiple maritime strikes targeting vessels off the coast of Venezuela and Colombia and across the Caribbean. And I pulled a couple images here, as you can see. These were called, quote, lethal kinetic operations, close quote, against boats the US government alleged were involved in narcotics trafficking, resulting in numerous fatalities. I think the number, there was another strike that just happened 2 days ago, and I think the total number now is 30. According to official statements, these actions were conducted in international waters and framed within a non-international armed conflict against so-called narco-terrorist networks. The US administration has justified these strikes very tenuously on the grounds of national security, citing the persistent flow of drugs in its territory as an urgent threat. But critics, and there are many, cite the lack of transparency regarding the evidence linking the targeted vessels to specific criminal organizations. So many believe that these attacks to be extrajudicial killings and illegal under international law. The reason why I bring this up, and perhaps you can see it from these images as well, is that when I first saw those videos that were produced by US official military channels, I immediately thought, this looks like Call of Duty. And I thought, in my gameplay, have I done similar things? Even the official language of lethal kinetic operations and tactical strikes on narco-terrorist networks is also found in the game's dialogue and narrative. I was struck by the comparison and the emotions felt about such strikes when I performed the same thing in my own gameplay. It made me think about the connections between one effective negotiation when seeing the news and how much negotiation a player does when contemplating one's morals, ethical, or even legal sensibilities during gameplay. I wondered whether or not our gameplay impacts the way we might feel about the news of U.S. military violence and about these boat strikes. And this led me to question about what and how I feel when playing a game like Call of Duty, which presents a political ideology which is questionable and, more to the point, so different from my own. So in preparing for my talk today, I thought about video games as cultural texts, as Stuart Hall insistence that such text functions as contested sites of reception, where audiences not only consume but interpret, repurpose, and reframe meaning in ways that shape their understanding of the world. And I thought about how games can be rehearsal machines for public feeling, how game players engage with these interactive digital experiences, including opportunities for players to make moral and ethical decisions within their gameplay. And I thought about how this may shape how players feel and think about American power. But cultural texts aren't just the texts themselves, but everything that surrounds our encountering of them. And this leads me to this concept of metagames, which according to Stephanie Boluk and Patrick Lemieux means, quote, everything occurring before, after, between, and during games, as well as everything located in, on, around, and beyond games, close quote. This helps us to see games within larger contexts as they, again, Boluk and Lemieux describe, go in, on, around, through, before, during, and after the gaming. So thinking about games as metagames instructs that games aren't only about the objects or the software itself, but all the practices, materialities, histories, communities, and relations that surround it. For Boluk and Lemieux, metagaming is a critical practice, a way to intervene to better study and comprehend the shape of prevailing cultural and economic uses of video games. And we can focus on all the meaning, feeling, practice, ideology, and habit which inhabit them. Metagames also brings me in my thinking to affect theory in ways to enrich our understanding of how video games feel, not just how they function or what they mean. Through this relationship, we can see how affect emerges through practices beyond codified mechanics of games. Affects like frustration, exhilaration, shame, pride, anxiety, and so on arise not just from formal game systems, but from these peripheral, emergent, or around the game interactions. So understanding metagame enlarges where affect is generated. And since metagames include the materiality of hardware, interfaces, the physical environment, we can examine these dimensions in the way that they might contribute to emotional or sensory intensities of temporalities, anticipation, and spectatorship. This can help us to understand how games are experienced emotionally and intellectually. This, of course, I think we all would probably agree is essential, as we all know that video games have always had a tremendous capacity to affect our emotions. Added to the fact, as Miriam Deed writes, the sheer size of the video game industry, that games are the future of art, entertainment, sports, and community organizing, it is essential to understand the way games shape the world around us, culturally, economically, linguistically, aesthetically, and politically. Video games in their many forms are ubiquitous these days in our everyday media landscape. It's clear that in popular culture, so much of their structures and aesthetics inform everything from cinema to contemporary art to even pedagogical strategies, self-help manuals. Global video game sales vastly outpace film and recorded music sales combined. And I think in 2024, there were over 3 billion game players. So for today, as I've said, I'm interested in how games make us feel and what we can learn about this. Or as a 1983 EA video game advertisement said on how games might, quote, bring our thoughts and feelings closer together. And this, by the way, is from Deed's book. And it's pretty funny because the advertisement starts with the question, can computer games make you? And this is an important trend, though, in video game studies, to think about how games make complex meanings across history, bodies, hardware, and code. And this is why some look to affect theory in order to gain a historically and materially rich understanding of how video games came to emphasize an effectual claim to the body. And I'll talk a little later on why I think affect is useful here, but obviously the way that a game player interacts and engages with video games lies at the heart of our bodies, picking up a game controller and using keyboards and so on. So as Dan Pinchbeck, a prominent game designer, once said, quote, "You get to be in a world. No other medium does that, gets even close to doing that," close quote. So the sensation of moving through the world, plus the haptic connection with the controller, becomes the conduit for which the system interacts with our bodies and emotions. In a way, video games are simply, quote, "a whole way of life," as Annabelle describes. And to study this whole way of life, I put video games in conversation with affect theory to trace what Patrick Jagoda argues as, quote, "the phenomenal residue of historical convergence between technoscientific and aesthetic horizons." Video games contribute to the sensory texture of everyday computational experience, offering everything from color to rhythm, form, sound, tone, and texture. They require players to make decisions and to operate within these constraints and rules that structure those decisions. Players must also grasp the underlying logic of the system. In doing so, games draw players into a circuit of affect that links computational processes to broader systems of ideology, narrative, and aesthetics, and of course, embodiment. As such, video games, as a pervasive and influential medium, are distinctly situated to express forms of contemporary subjectivity shaped by digital mediation and circulation. Now, affect is an infamously elusive concept, which perhaps is unsurprising for a theoretical framework that seeks to account for the complex forces shaping emotional experience. I think affect theorists generally define affect as a pre-personal intensity, and that comes from Brian Masumi, and bodily capacity that mediates between sensation, emotion, and cognition, shaping how subjects experience, relate, and act within social, political, and technological environments. I use the term to describe the dimensions of emotion, feeling, and bodily engagement, what Sarah Ahmed calls the sticky connections between ideas, values, and objects. These affect attachments circulate, and here I'm borrowing from Teresa Brennan's theorization, among people within what the late, great Lauren Berlant described as a structure of feeling or an infrastructure of attachment that organizes collective life. Affect is often perceived only at the point of contact, at an interface, but some an interrepresentation in contact between individuals and their physical and social environments. So in connection with video games, affect gives us shape of the circulation of affect gives us shape of the circulation of affect across code, images, and bodies without reducing video games to either their representational qualities or their digital and mechanical properties. By taking up affect in video games, following Annabelle, we can see that the resemblances among the actions of a player's body, the actions of a game mechanics, and the actions of ideological signification to get at how video games and gamers as particular cultural formations are effectively charged. Thinking through affect in video games allows us to see how game mechanics are intimately tied to their representational practices, and that game mechanics and code and software are there themselves also kinds of fictions that we tell ourselves. Central to my discussion, affect theory shifts attention away from meaning-centered representational analyses, what games say, to pre- or non-representational registers of experience, what games do, the intensity, the body sensation, tonal atmosphere, and modes of attachment that shape how games are experienced. So in this realm of circulated feelings, bodies, language, and ideas, I want to turn to my two main studies here. Call of Duty franchise, especially its more recent installments, and a survey data gathered from Turkish gamers. Borrowing from Sarah Ahmed's notion of orientation, I'm interested in how games move effectively through and across bodies, expressing feelings as social practice rather than individual ones. I focus on Call of Duty because, quite simply, it's one of the most globally recognized video game franchises and a major vehicle for representing US militarism. Few media forms have done more to normalize American security ideology in the last 20 years than Call of Duty. And while scholars have long focused on the ideological content of these war games, especially franchises like Call of Duty, which are marked by the increased collusion of US military institutions with the gaming industry. Player agency or player affect is often downplayed. So I'm building on some emerging scholarship here that connects affect with war games, especially Joseph Patterson's recent studies, where he interviewed a number of players and asked them effective questions about their gameplay. Lastly, I selected the series for study as it is a game that I'm most familiar with, and as a cultural interpreter, I'd like to use my own playthrough of how and where I see affect. So military games like Call of Duty or Battlefield or Medal of Honor have often been read primarily in terms of representation, how they depict themes like heroism, national identity, and historical warfare. Scholars like Lenore and Caldwell, among others, observe that the interpretation of mainstream franchises, though, should focus more on the attempts to create an effective framework that emphasizes certain emotions in players. Patterson agrees, contending that these franchises do so on purpose to elicit particular emotional responses in game players. And since these games often shape how global players encounter the United States, I'm interested in what kinds of effective orientations toward America they might produce. To give some brief background here, the franchise has evolved from a historical first-person shooter rooted in World War II to a sprawling multimedia universe encompassing multiple historical, contemporary, and even speculative futuristic settings. What happens in the more recent installments, Modern Warfare and Black Ops, among others, is what I find most interesting, as there is a subtle tonal shift. The protagonists of the game are no longer invincible heroes, but weary operatives, navigating moral ambiguity, mission orders, chain of command, and geopolitical complexities. These recent arcs push into the contemporary geopolitics involving covert operations, terrorism, and asymmetrical warfare, foregrounding moral relativism and blurred boundaries between heroism and atrocity. And I find it fascinating that the games point to a contemporary moment of clandestine, dirty war, secret CIA operations, or the psychological manipulation involved, and the militarization of technology through drone warfare, which now dominate our 21st century conflicts. Turning to gameplay, though, one of the first things that makes Call of Duty so fun to play is the game's interface with its combination of visual realism, sound design, weapon recoil, animations, cinematic cutscenes, and so on, all fostering an atmospheric effect of intense immediacy. Explosions have both visual and sound effects. The player sounds are muffled by helmets. You can hear your character breathing or their heartbeat when your health is low. These sensory cues work to produce corporal effects with the game player, creating that intensity of presence and orientation. And as I play, I notice how the mechanics are tightly bound to affect. When the character is injured, the health system features a damage feedback. Here you can see the red edges on the screen in the upper right corner, or auditory cues and haptic controller vibrations that connect me to the immediate body alarm of my character. It tells me to seek cover, wait for health regeneration, and there's a sequence of shock, retreat, and recovery, which produces a loop that heightens intensity, tension, and then ultimately relief. This is something central to Call of Duty's effect, this adrenaline of strategy, attack, tactics, and survival. And as I said, Patterson argues that Call of Duty uses effect to emphasize these emotions on purpose in players, adding that developers, quote, aim to construct this effective framework for experience, targeting and exploiting embodiment more than cognition to immerse the player in the game world, close quote. At the core of the game's ideological work is the effective experience of being under threat, of defending civilians, nations, and borders. Narratively, Call of Duty continues to rely on what we might call just war tropes. U.S. forces in the games appear morally conflicted, yet justified, while enemies, terrorists, rogue states, mercenaries often remain othered. The effective atmospheres and temporal modalities or modulations, the ambience of war, pacing of campaigns, which is what I play most, and even the temporality of firefights, all enhance affect, marking out emotional horizons of dread, adrenaline, and relief. So when you are playing the, quote, pre-conscious intensities, close quote, following Brian Masumi, affect as intensity precedes emotion in Call of Duty. And the moments of the feedback, the gunfire, explosion, low health warnings, all deepen the function of effective intensifiers connecting to the narrative. The first-person perspective fuses that perception and emotion with the geopolitical logic, making urgency and control feel like moral reflexes. The game thus naturalizes military violence through effective immediacy, training the body to feel its necessity. For example, in the Modern Warfare series, there are sequences where you run through war-torn cities under fire, intercut with calm moments of briefings, or returning to base, and so forth, which escalates the effect. These calmer cycles increase the shock of return to combat, amplifying the contrast. In my own playthroughs, I become increasingly aware of how it trains perception and emotion in alignment with its geopolitical logic. The immersive mechanics, its use of first-person perspective, the sensory intensity of sound and motion, the imperative to act quickly, allows me to feel this militaristic effective urgency, precision, control, and more problematically, a righteousness of action. I encountered moments of discomfort, missions involving civilian casualties or ethical questionable operations. Patterson's player interviews echo this. Many players talk about slowing down, act cautiously, or even skip cutscenes, registering ineffective tension. And this is something that I also found myself doing. Knowing the historical context of games like Call of Duty Cold War, where one is doing clandestine activity that we all now know which to be very dubious, it was challenging for me, for an example, to see a cutscene with President Ronald Reagan, a figure that I find truly odious and perhaps is the great villain of my lifetime. And yet, I played, distracting myself with the ideological complexity and focus on things that I do like about the game, which is the strategy, the ability, and as I said, running around, shooting things and blowing stuff up. Yet others deflect the discomfort in Patterson's survey as well, saying, quote, it's just a game, which neutralizes the dissonance of the game player. The game anticipates this too. It performs moral complexity as a part of its entertainment, and their game kind of winks at us, telling us that they also know that these things are complicated and there's nuance, but that kind of gives us a gesture that we're also in on it. And the result, I think, is an effective sanitation of violence. Lethal force remains narratively justified even when ethically troubling. So Call of Duty's effective design, coupled with its moral ambiguity, stylized U.S. militarism, perhaps conditioning players to rationalize it when we see it elsewhere. So across its shifting historical settings, the series stages a dialectic between duty and individuality, valor and trauma, control and chaos, and presents action as spatially minimized or mechanically consequence-free. In order to, as Patterson writes, create powerful emotional moments that shape players' attitudes on specific issues and contribute to a more positive outlook on war and the military. In a way, the game transforms moral compromise into an effective realism, something that feels human rather than ideological. And this is where I think I find things to be fairly pernicious, as this effective training has consequences beyond the screen. When we encounter real-world justifications for U.S. drone strikes or naval operations, their supposed moral complexity can feel familiar, as the sonic and visual feedback might magnify spectacle in the game, but it mutes the consequences of the violence. The contextual suffering or aftermath is often elided. And I'm curious if we then allow nuance in our reading of current events, perhaps rethinking the extrajudicial killings of those in the boat strikes by the US military, because we have done the same thing in our gameplay. And we know that narratively, those strikes were also done with similar intent at complicated or complex justifications. So to read games like Call of Duty as effective systems takes into consideration how our bodies, code, Hardware, images, sounds, and socio-historical contexts work together to give shape to feelings that exceed any one of these locations or modes of interpretation. And I'm asking myself, how do these games translate the abstractions of geopolitics into those haptic sensations? In a way, exemplifying what I mentioned earlier, Berlant's effective infrastructures, or the cultural systems that organize collective attachments and emotional investments in ways that sustain existing social and political order. And with this in mind, I turn to my survey of Turkish gamers and what I've learned from it. I'm led by the question of, how do Turkish gamers mediate their ethical experiences when encountering the United States, and how do players narrativize their sensations afterwards? And overall, the responses indicate that players generally associate American culture with games that explicitly depict US settings, histories, or ideologies, especially those that dramatize freedom, violence, and consumerism. And I'd like to share a few points of information before I get to my interpretation. And I think I've got that. Yeah, here you go. So there were around 30 participants, ages 14 to 40. I think the average age was 20, 21 that took part in the survey. 6% identified as men, 30% identified as women, and the rest identified as non-binary. Participants mostly frequently cited the following games, as you can see on the screen: Grand Theft Auto, Red Dead Redemption, Call of Duty, and there were a number of others like Life is Strange, Fallout, Detroit Becomes Human, BioShock, so on. And I think there are a number of takeaways that I get from the survey. And while doing this and while looking at the responses, I realized that I've made a huge mistake in that I realized that this is going to have to be a part of a much bigger work. And so I'm now kind of contemplating the ways in which to expand this because the responses, I think, were quite enriching. Players most often encountered the US through these familiar franchises like Grand Theft Auto or Red Dead Redemption, Call of Duty, which, as I said, portray America as a paradoxical space of freedom and corruption, realism, and exaggeration. And while players recognize the entertainment value of such distortions, they nonetheless absorb cultural information from them. Respondents frequently associated US-based games with ideals of freedom, individualism, and consumerism, values that appear both celebrated and critiqued in their gameplay. And while many noted reinforcement of stereotypes such as violence, exceptionalism, guns, others read certain titles like Red Dead Redemption 2 or Detroit Becomes Human as exposing racial or social inequalities, or even at times critiquing US imperialism. And finally, in comparisons with other media, most respondents felt that the games, through their interactivity, provide a more immersive and experiential understanding of American culture than film or television. Now, moreover, I think the survey underscores how US-based video games function as vehicles of cultural export, extending American myths into transnational contexts. And I think that's something that we might all agree, like other forms of popular culture. For the Turkish players, games created an accessible yet distorted America, what we may expect a hybrid of realism and simulation. Call of Duty, Grand Theft Auto, Red Dead Redemption series in particular translate US history and social critique into playable narratives, where the spectacle of video games converges to reproduce fascination with America. And by spectacle, of course, I'm using Guy Debord's idea that everything that was directly lived has moved away into a representation, offering simulated participation in being. Respondents demonstrated sophistication in recognizing the paradox of realism and exaggeration in digital depictions of the US, articulating awareness of the slippage between authenticity and artifice. And here you can see on the screen one of the direct quotes from the responses. Respondents observed that open world structures naturalize ideas of freedom and self-reliance, yet also expose contradictions of inequality and power. Games such reveal tensions between critique and complicity in portraying racism and class hierarchy. And one thing that I found to be quite interesting is that players were acutely aware of this tension between inequality that is produced in the games. And to me, it shows how many Turkish players, and I of course suspect their global counterparts, have decent cultural literacy skills when engaging with video games. Aptly, one wrote, quote, "When there is still an American military base in my country, which is 10,000 kilometers away from the US, how could I ever believe in the cool American soldier saving the world narrative?" And the smiley face was also in the survey answer. The survey indicates that Turkish players engage US-based games with critical awareness, balancing fascination with ideological critique. Their responses underscore how affect, the circulation of sensation, immersion, and critique, mediates their experience of American cultural power. There's definitely, as I said, more to do here, but the responses gathered from Turkish players illuminate how America, through affect, takes shape across different and diverse gaming experiences. While games like Call of Duty offer a concentrated instance of militarized affect, the survey reveals that sensations of America extend across genres, from violence to Grand Theft Auto to the historicism of Red Dead Redemption. Players repeatedly describe these games as realistic yet exaggerated, or immersive and emotionally convincing, indicating their understanding of the United States arises less from just representational accuracy than from sustained affective contact. Ultimately, the survey offers empirical grounding for affect theory's claims that cultural meaning is transmitted not only through images or narratives, but through emotional and bodily intensities. And Turkish players experience America as an effective formation that is both immersive, contradictory, and also ideological charged. So turning to my conclusion here, in placing affect theory in direct conversation with video games and game players, we're able to zero in on all those contact zones where mechanics, interface, and narrative work together to produce these intensities, attachments, and atmospheres. And I think affect theory allows us to perceive games as both representational systems and as environments that organize feeling and distribute sensation across the human and technological boundary. And as I mentioned earlier, this allows for the examination of all the ethical, social, and political dimensions of games, including what stories are being told, who has power, and how the structural platform shapes narrative and haptic possibilities and limitations. With this understanding, I think future study might treat games not as merely as text to be decoded, but as embodied, temporal, and infrastructural practices that produce routinized effects. Game scholars could then examine longitudinal effects of exposure to the affective fields of video games and study the differential experiences of players from marginalized groups, or comparative affective studies between mainstream war games and more critical military games like Metal Gear Solid, or I was just talking with students about Spec Ops: The Line, that attempt to unsettle the effective norms of the US, what Call of Duty often helps to solidify. I see Call of Duty creating or crafting an effective field that draws players into these contact zones that produces effective registers of war. As war-themed games proliferate in the US and globally, such effective analysis becomes essential. The critical game player must, as some of my survey responders mentioned, be clear on the ideological framing of America in the games they play. The survey reinforces this view, suggesting that as affect circulates amongst players as both attraction and critique, it intensifies a game's ideological and sensory power. As this conference theme focuses on global perspectives of the United States, I want to conclude here that as the US is experienced and perceived through gameplay, through pleasure, fascination, and critique, it does not appear as some abstract identity, but as an atmosphere sustained by our digital interactivity. In this sense, the survey responses illustrate how sensations of agency, freedom, and domination particularly in my case study of Call of Duty, attempt to aestheticize US hegemony in the world. Mainstream franchises such as Call of Duty should be understood as complex cultural artifacts composed of multiple layers of meaning. Rather than merely transmitting militaristic ideologies, these games construct an effective aesthetic that allows players to engage with the emotional and ethical complexities of war. And crucially, the meanings they generate emerge through the players themselves, who must be recognized as conscious agents actively participating in the production of interpretation and feeling. So in following my friend and game scholar, Jesse Ramirez, as games operate as sites where the dynamic contradictions through which hegemony is constructed, contested, and renewed, ideology, narrative, and mechanics intersect to regulate desire and consent, to legitimize and contest power, to rework collective memory, and to stage speculative futures. Similarly, then, it is why I think we need to attend to the affective dimensions of video games, as it reveals broader cultural and ideological stakes of our play. In tracing how we move through these digital worlds and how games in turn move through us, I see gameplay as a cultural technology that shapes not only what we feel, but the very horizons of our collective imagination. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bryan Banker. That was an incredible talk. A lot of things that interest me as well, and our conversations before.
Definitely.
So definitely. So we have plenty of time. Without further ado, I will open the floor to questions. Of course. Someone wants to speak. Go ahead.
Olga, go first.
Sorry, could you repeat again?
I asked Olga to go first.
Okay, all right. Olga, maybe you could go first. Are you there? Maybe we can have Emilio go first, and after we can hear Olga.
I wanted to thank Professor Banker for this interesting keynote, which made me think a lot, especially in the first part when we talked about interfaces and ways of visualizing war. That reminded me of those chapters in Cyborg Manifesto, where Donna Haraway talks about the scientific look that looks like military maps, and she builds an analogy in the way science looks at the world and the way war looks at the world. And that made me think about language and about especially the language that you addressed, the one of military professionalism. A soldier is not a soldier anymore, it's an operative, etc. And I was wondering, since you use this framework of affect, I was thinking, maybe there is a connection. We are used to think that bureaucratic or scientific language is supposed to distance from the affect of the object of study and the object of conflict in the case of war. But what if the language of military professionalism actually helps affecting a sense of excitement towards the military profession itself, if not for I studied detective fiction for a long time, and I think that there is an idea also in medical dramas, an idea of the professionalism gives you at least the idea of power. And I want to know if affect theory can help us map this environment in the domain of language. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's a rich question. I mean, definitely, I think in the question of affect, I think the way we think about those affective registers of excitement or frustration or anxiety, we need obviously different kinds of language and languages, if you will, to include everything from detective or military language in which to kind of describe those things. And so I think there is definitely something there. As you were speaking, it made me think of just how pervasive that military language is. I watch American football. I grew up in it. My father was a coach, and how often we use similar military languages in which to describe, gameplay, right? Sports. or in various office or meetings or even discussions with students, for an example, you can hear some of the kind of language creep into the normal discourse or discussion. And I think in the sense of affect, I think definitely that the way that we use language in which to perhaps identify and intensify the kind of registers that are felt, I think there's a lot there, definitely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that answer. I'm going to go ahead and let Olga ask her question if she's there.
Hello, yeah. Thank you for this fascinating talk, Dr. Banker. And I must admit that I myself am not very knowledgeable in the field of video games. But what strikes me as particularly fascinating about this whole discourse is the fact that those video games seem to address a very specific historical set of eras, either the modernity or maybe the Second World War. We hardly see anything on American Civil War. We certainly don't see much choice on American Revolution or maybe other historical eras. Compared to the more European look at the world of computer games, where there may be themes such as ancient Rome, Napoleonic Wars, and so on. And I've just been wondering if you could expand a bit more on what we can deduce about the American society in general and the fans of computer games thinking about this, and maybe if there is hope in introducing history learning, especially among young people, through devising new computer games on a historical subject. So, yes.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I would probably relinquish to the experts, Eileen being one of them, about the types of games that describe the kinds of things that you're talking about. I can speak to one series or franchise, Assassin's Creed. They have kind of bounced around a number of different generations and eras, including the American Revolutionary War. But in these kind of military stylized games, at least the big games, the franchises like Call of Duty, you're right, there is an absence of both Civil War or pre-Civil War kind of conflict. And I think a lot of it, and the game experts can correct me if I'm wrong, I think one of the reasons, my assumption is that the technology of warfare in these particular warfares might not be so attractive for the big game franchises, right? It takes a minute or so to like load a musket in, you know, the American Civil War and prior, whereas the kind of slick nature of the militarism that we see in more contemporary themed games, I think is what drives a lot of gameplay. But there are game franchises that do tend to look at history in a bigger picture. I could also, although it would be pure speculation, would argue that one of the reasons why, I mean, in American popular media and popular culture, the Civil War dominates, right? But it's often through this historical lens that removes a lot of the ugliness of that conflict and what led to the conflict. And my guess is that some of those moral ambiguities and complexities might be difficult to translate on screen compared to what we have in our contemporary gameplay with things like Call of Duty. But yes, there are, I think, a lot of both indie games, and I know a lot of computer games, but also kind of console games that do try to look at different historical periods in different ways. And I think Assassin's Creed most famously is one that tries to kind of capture using experts and cultural experts to make sure that the game is as accurate as possible, even though it's obviously quite a fantasy. But I don't know, actually. I mean, some of the game nerds in here might know more if there are games that showcase that the let's say pre-World War I era military conflict, but I'm not aware of it. I think as I said, I think technology is what drives a lot of that, or the idea of technology in warfare, what drives a lot of the game sales.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for the question. I will go ahead and give the floor to Chan Fırtına for their question. Go ahead.
Hi, Hocam, again.
Hello.
Before moving on to my question, there's a franchise game series. It's not as big as Call of Duty, but it takes place during the Civil War, actually. It's called Call of Juarez, where you play as a Confederate soldier with your brother, and then things happen. Although it doesn't delve into the more ideological, political aspects that much, there is a certain, let's say, space again, where the Civil War is represented. But again, it's kind of devoid of open.
What was the name of the game? Sorry.
Call of Juarez, Juarez.
Juarez.
Yeah, it's an old one. They don't make those anymore. As for my question, you talked about like rationalizing the lethality of the especially extrajudicial lethality of, I don't want to say war, well, let's say conflicts, quote unquote. That made me think, perhaps rather than rationalizing and taking my cue a bit from Deleuze and Guattari, we can perhaps talk about a sort of a re-stratification of the body, because at the end of the day, we do control a body in video games, and this re-stratification into this new ideological space, especially in games like Call of Duty, where the ideological space, let's say, is more aligned with the American ideology. This kind of affect, but perhaps more than affect, and more than rationale and rationality, and more than it goes beyond conditioning. Perhaps thinking about the whole affect part and the interactivity of video games from this perspective would, at least for me, I don't know, open a new space to think through this, controlling a different body that's on your screen where you kill people essentially and so on, which kind of makes it, I will say, normalize, which normalizes the killing aspect, but I think it goes beyond normalizing again. It's something more than what we do with our consciousness, perhaps. Or if this makes sense to you, was my question.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I got it, I mean, going back, like a lot of the affect theorists more recently have kind of looked to contest Deleuze in that regard. But I'll set that aside. I'd rather kind of want to talk about something that you'd mentioned, and it made me think about in preparing for this talk. Actually, I had it in mind to make some pretty wild claims, I think, or what I've learned to be unsubstantiable claims in regarding conditioning that I initially thought about, in our gameplay, as we are controlling, right? And remember, I mean, it's an illusion of control, right? Those the players, there also is there a logic or an algorithm that kind of determines or limits certain things, right? So even though we are given some opportunity and agency in gameplay, it's still kind of illusionary opportunity because we still have to play within the confines of that game. But in my thinking and preparing for this talk, I thought, does our gameplay kind of condition us in the real world to do or to make, in our case, or in my case, ethical justifications? And I use that word condition on purpose because I thought, and again, this is provocative, I thought that even when we're not playing militarized games like Call of Duty, even when we're making moral or ethical or questionable kind of decisions in gameplay, does that somehow then kind of make it easier for us to navigate or negotiate one's morality in the real world? And I thought that was very provocative. And I talked to my friend Jesse Ramirez who I've mentioned, and he was like, "Nah, you can't do that. It's too hard, I think, to substantiate that kind of claim." But intuitively, somehow, getting to kind of what you were saying there, I feel like there is something to be said about this connection between, and to bring in maybe that the first question with language, this relationship between, how we are interacting the game and the surrounding that encounter of video game play, and how that kind of imprints on us, or how we continue those interactions in the real world. And for an example, you just used, to kill people, right, in the video game. And Donald Trump, for an example, yesterday, in talking about the legality of these boat strikes, he came out and said that I don't need U.S. Congress to declare war to do the things that I'm doing. We're just going to kill them. We'll just kill people directly. And I think, when hearing that, it's obviously shocking and perhaps not surprising. But at the same time, I think, is there some way in which that we think about these boat strikes, and we start to think, well, in our game, the game produces a kind of a negotiated justification. We can kind of understand it. So therefore, the U.S. military also probably knows that this is complicated, but they still did it. And is there kind of also a conditioning in thinking of that justification? There, I think I need to do a much different kind of approach to make that claim. But intuitively, which, as a cultural scientist, maybe I shouldn't say intuitively, somehow, it feels like there's something there that helps us to kind of read the real world from the kind of effectual gameplay that we encounter.
Well, thank you, John.
My pleasure. Hopefully I answered it.
Thank you so much. Yasmina, you can go ahead and ask your question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Banker, for your presentation. I've never studied or played video games, so yeah, I have very, very little knowledge about it. But it's just like my question here is about the consumer, like who are the most users, like in which part of the world or something that. Are there any statistics, like in that sense, like who are the most, like the first consumers of these militarized, especially and popular video games? They come from the global north, global south, and yeah, it's just, I want to know.
Yeah, the U.S. Dominates all global sales and consumption of video games. So in that sense, I think there's an easier. And I'm not quite interested, because I think people have done it as well, about the reception of games like Call of Duty or militarized games on American audiences, because I think the connections there may be a little bit more clear. And so one of the reasons why I interviewed or had my Turkish students here in Ankara do the survey is because I wanted to get their semi-outsider perspectives. And I say semi-outsider because they're still kind of connected in certain ways with, the American culture that they consume with video games, film, and music, but still get their kind of perceptions in receiving these ideological embedded messages of their gameplay, and then the sensations of feeling the United States in their gameplay. So in that sense, the United States, yes, definitely is the largest consumer of some of these games, I think. But in all of gaming, I don't know, but I'm sure that there are statistics. One of the things that I'm really interested in here, though, just if I can break away from the question, was, and I think this is what I will aim to do for this future project, is broaden the survey, both not just within Turkey, but maybe outside of it. Because one of the things that kind of motivated me is that, to take a Turkish example, since I'm here, when a Turkish gamer is playing Call of Duty, do they feel about things that they during their gameplay that an American gamer would feel, right? In one sense, when I talk to my students, I'm not surprised because, they're smart, but I guess I'm caught off guard by their high sophistication in the way they read the kinds of games that they encounter. And I'm always fascinated with that high level of sophistication, so that our gamers that are not American, do they have maybe a different set of cultural literacy skills or abilities to kind of negotiate those encounters in ways that maybe Americans don't, because we kind of take these things for granted, right? And so one of the things that I'm really interested is to globalize that survey in a way to think about, what happens when players from post-colonized spaces are interacting or playing with games that take place in Call of Duty, the kind of Russian language or Arabic language countries. They don't exist, but they're very easily coded as places like Iraq or so on, or Russia. And so, what is happening when those gamers from those particular areas are doing and feeling and thinking when they encounter these games that produce a U.S. militarized ideology, right? Or even not even military, a U.S. ideology, right, of power. And so that's something that I'm interested in transitioning to maybe globalize this, to think about how affect kind of works through global gamers as they encounter the United States, and then maybe what we can get from that.
Yeah, it's just perhaps like I could add something here. It's like I think that would also differ by age, race, I think gender, and
Definitely.
Yeah, doing the survey would perhaps, I don't know, you would have to go for instance, like for a particular age group or a particular gender or something to be able perhaps to make the, I don't know, because there are so many.
Or at least acknowledge it. Yeah, at least acknowledge these different positions, right? Yeah, definitely.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much. We have one more person, Mohammed Sardar Yuruk, who wants to ask. Go ahead.
Hello.
Hello, sir.
Hello. First of all,
this, by the way, guys, everyone, this is the one that helped me with the survey. So anyway,
all praise goes to him. Thank you for the presentation, first of all. I would like to take a moment to move away from militaristic shooters, realistic shooters like Call of Duty, and ask you a question about sci-fi and shooter games. For example, what happens when we draw Halo or Crisis or Mass Effect, when we look at the hyper-masculine, technologically driven nature of those games and combine them with affect theory? Do we get a similar effect that military shooters would have on us, or is there a sense of maybe intensification or another perspective happening there?
Yes. I think this is a really interesting question. And it's, as I mentioned before with Chan's question and my answer, it's something that intuitively I can only say that I'm thinking about, wherein that even in the kind of fantastical themed games like Halo, for an example, that there is still a militaristic logic or language or mechanics or the kind of affectual registers of intensity, of relief, of injury, of anxiety. And so in that sense, those games are going to, I would say, effectively work on the body and circulate in the body in very similar ways, because frankly, a lot of them are the same. But to connect the kind of effective registers to gameplay, which is to say that while we're playing these games, and even though we're shooting aliens in some fantastical science fictional future, it would be difficult. And this is why I said, intuitively, I feel like there's a connection there. But I think it would be difficult to see if we can kind of map the trajectory or the connection between, yes, I'm playing Halo, this machine cyborg,
artificially enhanced soldier.
Okay,
Master Chief.
Right. Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not nerding it up. And to kind of connect that gameplay to what we might see when we're like an American soldier in some desert, right? And I feel like intuitively, as I said, I feel like there is a connection there, but I haven't yet thought about the way in which to map that out, because I wanted to make that claim that even when we're not playing those kinds of games like Call of Duty, the impact or the effectual impact is potentially doing something similar. So I don't know if that answers your question, but the idea of the kind of, regardless of the setting or maybe the theme of the game, I think if it still matches a militaristic kind of presentation, and I think that it's easier to connect the two, right? But to be able to map that, I'm not quite sure how to do that yet.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Thank you so much. George has a question in chat that I will read for you.
Okay. Thank you.
He asks, to what extent do these games and their experience reflect the increasing privatization and corporate subcontracting transnational character of armed conflict? Or are we still locked in worlds of national government militaries fighting?
Yeah, it's a great question. In fact, in Modern Warfare, Call of Duty Modern Warfare, it's a sub-series. You are basically an operator, to use the term, and you work in direct contact with and relationship with defense contractors. And in, I think it's Modern Warfare 2, you actually fight them at the end of the game, wherein you are still an operator, you're doing clandestine activity, and then there's intrigue, and you find out that the defense contractor, in collaboration with the U.S. military, a general in this case, are doing bad stuff. And so the end of the kind of final boss, if you will, is trying to eradicate or kill and capture that defense contractor. And so I think that the game series definitely is bringing that or presenting these kinds of modern systems of warfare into the forefront. And I think this is one of the reasons why I find those game arcs like Black Ops and Modern Warfare to be so intriguing and fascinating, is because they allow, through the defense contractors, right? They allow for the kind of opportunity to contextualize the militarized operations, right? So, if you're familiar with, obviously, the U.S. military, they have a strict code of conduct, right? Wherein the CIA or defense contractors do not. And so the game designers, I think, know this, and therefore create opportunities to bring in a nuance of whether or not that's morally or legally ethical. But because it's contractors, right, we're kind of deputizing that to them, and that allows for some space of, I don't know if redemption is the right word, but some space of signification for the U.S. military to still be the kind of, protected entity, where it's these defense contractors that are doing the kind of dirty work. And I think the games do that a lot, especially in these modern iterations. And that, earlier in my talk, that's one of the things that I find the game to be pretty, I think I used the word pernicious, because I feel like the game knows what it's doing. And I feel like there's this gesture of kind of like inclusivity. Like, we both kind of know that these things are nuanced or whatever. And by acknowledging that, that allows for us to kind of like, yeah, it's okay. Then, yes, when I blow up this ship, there might be some innocent people on that, but, there's nuance, it's complex. And I think that is how these new games that are influenced and connected heavily with the U.S. military are able to do both, create that kind of complexity, this asymmetrical warfare, the clandestine activity, plus the kind of heroism that is often produced when we are watching or playing games involving the U.S. military.
Thank you so much. And with that, I think we're going to close out the session. Thank you so much to Dr. Bryan Banker. That was an incredible keynote address. I personally have a lot of questions, but I will hold back for the time. With that, I will be closing out the session. Our session will start pretty soon, so we'll give a couple of minutes for everyone to take a breather, and then we will come back with the last session of the day. Thank you so much to everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.